But for now, we're going to turn back to nature, specifically to the ways that it interacts with the economy. As the Charlie diagram and the modified ecosystem diagram illustrate, all economic activity can be traced back to the environment, but in distinct ways. These can be grouped into three categories: resource functions, environmental functions, and sink functions. Resource functions describe the role of the environment in providing resources, such as harvestable trees, catchable fish, and extractable petroleum. In other words, the things that the primary sector extracts or harvests are provided by the environment. Environmental functions cover the role of ecosystems in providing services, such as clean air, regulation of the water cycle, or restoration of soil fertility when fields are left fallow. To some extent, these services are used directly in economic production. They're also valuable for the continued functioning of ecosystems. Sink functions describe the role of the environment in absorbing wastes from economic processes. Some sinks are renewable. For example, when you put manure on a pasture, the pasture breaks it down and can eventually absorb more. But renewable sinks can be overwhelmed, and the absorptive capacity for others is simply non-renewable. This is the case with persistent toxins, things that tend not to break down, so they build up in whatever sink we put them in. Careless use of sinks, that is, throwing out too much stuff, can damage all three natural functions. It can damage the ability of sinks to absorb more wastes. But also, if we damage a forest by dumping waste in it, we can limit that forest's ability to regulate water flows or to provide wood. These three types of nature's roles are economically important, not only because they support economic activity, but also due to the ways we pay for them, or mostly don't pay for them. Resource functions are the most commonly paid for. If I own land with trees on it or oil under it, I'll make you pay something before you can extract the resources. But there are famous environmental problems around overharvest of fisheries when nobody owns the fish, and so nobody has to pay for the fish themselves. With waste sinks, sometimes there's a charge, as when the town dump levies a fee on the bags of garbage you drop off. But there's another whole class of famous environmental problems involving the free emission of pollutants into the air and water we all share. Environmental functions are paid for least of all. If I own a wetland that reduces the severity of flooding for downstream communities, how do I make those communities pay for the service my land is providing? If I own a forest that's pulling carbon dioxide from the air and pumping out oxygen, I'm benefiting everyone in the world. How do I get you all to pay me for the good I'm doing? We'll revisit those issues when we look at value in Chapter 7, but for now, it's time to look at technological evolution. In looking at ecosystems, I said that successful mutations allow an organism to do a better job finding a gradient, to capture or utilize a bigger gradient or a new one, or to improve utilization of captured gradients. But if you look at human technology, you see that technological innovations can be viewed exactly the same way. Technologies for improved finding aren't the most common, but they do exist. Examples would be seismic equipment that helps engineers look for oil fields, or sonar devices used on fishing boats to help figure out where the fish are. Technologies to capture or use a new or bigger gradient are all over the place. Massive wind turbines capture a bigger gradient than smaller ones. A dam with a hydropower facility captures the gradient in the river water. And an internal combustion engine in a car or a jet engine on an airplane is each a way of utilizing the very powerful gradient contained in petroleum. There are also plenty of examples of improved utilization. A particularly dramatic one was when steam engines changed from being pistons, like on the classic locomotive, to rotary turbines, raising efficiency from about 5% towards 50%. Beyond these examples, if you look at any human technological innovation, just like any evolutionary change in a plant or animal, you can classify it in terms of one or more of these aspects of its relationship to gradients. Coevolution is another process shared by ecosystems and economies. In an ecosystem, species are constantly becoming a better fit for their particular environment, and by evolving, they change the environment for other species, which will then tend to evolve so as to better prosper in this new, altered environment. There are some pretty basic instances of coevolution in the history of life on Earth. An old example would be when plants became abundant, creating a new source of food. That changed the environment, creating new opportunities for animals that could take advantage of the plant's new capability by eating the plants. A few billion years ago, there was very little oxygen in our atmosphere, and so the environment was filled with anaerobes, organisms that operate without oxygen and generally don't prosper in its presence. Then cyanobacteria evolved and went nutty photosynthesizing and producing oxygen. The new environment was generally hostile to the anaerobes, which either hid in places with little oxygen or died off. The flip side was the evolution of aerobic organisms, things that need oxygen, things like us. On a smaller scale, coevolution includes bees and flowers, where the flower provides sugary nectar to the bee and thus encourages behavior that moves the flower's pollen around. Another example would be predator and prey, where the prey gets better at running away or hiding, and the predator gets better at chasing or finding. But human technologies also co-evolve with their environments. As I mentioned before, early steam engines were only about 1% efficient, if that. They were also incredibly bulky. With such high fuel demands, they were very expensive to operate, so they weren't worth installing in factories, and it would have been impossible to put them on ships or locomotives. But there was one place where steam engines were viable, at the mouth of a coal mine. The fuel was right there, and since transportation was expensive, the coal was relatively cheap. And the owners needed water pumped from deep in the mines, something that was impossible to do with muscle power. So there was an environment where the steam engine, even in its terribly inefficient early form, was economically fit, and so it survived and was able to evolve further. To wrap up, we'll draw one last set of parallels between ecosystems and economies. An ecosystem arises in the presence of sufficiently large gradients. Photosynthesis makes the solar gradient available to herbivores, and the rest of the consumers spread the energy around to the system as a whole. The ecosystem requires a gradient to continue. The larger the gradient, the more complex the ecosystem can be. The ecosystem reduces the gradient that feeds it, and an ecosystem is a dissipative structure. Turning to the economy, an economy arises in the presence of sufficiently large gradients. Technology makes those gradients accessible to us. It requires a gradient to continue. The larger the gradient, the more complex an economy it can support. It reduces the gradient that drives it. And finally, the economy is a dissipative structure. Next up, the long view on the physical evolution of the economy.